Well, I had a fun time last night at the dinner for the Honduras work. Enjoyed some food. There's some pupusas left over for lunch today, as well as refried beans and rice. So I hope you can stay for today's fellowship meal. And if you weren't here, you get a little taste of what we enjoyed last night. Yeah, today is the day when a lot of our lectionary readings focus on Jesus as the Good Shepherd. We've been reading that. I appreciate John and Edwina planning our worship today and incorporating other things to help us reflect on what it means for Jesus to be understood as our Good Shepherd. And I wanted to choose this passage, 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 24, as one for us to reflect on a little bit, think about, see what it says as we read it together. So starting in verse 16, 1 John chapter 3, we know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. So obviously, John is referring to the cross, and he's saying that who the Lord is defined by the cross, and what love is defined by the cross. That the penultimate expression of the love of God, which is the revelation of God's own self, is in the event of the cross. And of course, we've talked about how we need to understand the cross well, what is happening there. It's the selflessness of God, his unwillingness to lash out and harm his enemies, but instead to bless them and forgive them. And that is the expression of the divine love of God, of the very nature of God. And John's focusing on that, and he's saying this is how we know what love is, that Christ laid down his life. Some of our other readings from John, the Gospel of John, chapter 10, Jesus says very specifically, I'm choosing to do this. No one takes it from me. I'm not coerced into this. I'm choosing to lay my life down. It is my choice to do this out of love. And that's what John in this epistle is emphasizing as well. So love is defined by the cross, and God is defined by the cross. And the other thing that we see in this verse is that our ethics, how it is that we are to conduct ourselves, is defined by this same cross, this same love, because he says, in light of that cross, which shows us the love of God, he says we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. So when we find ourselves at the foot of the cross and meditate upon the meaning of what it is that God is doing for the world, we also discover what we are supposed to do, how we are supposed to live. And that's what John's talking about here. We lay our lives down. But verse 17 is a little bit surprising because laying our lives down is not as dramatic as I would have thought, right? I could have thought that, wow, you mean I've got to somehow sacrifice my very life. But John, when he illustrates what this means, he says, verse 17, but whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? So he says we need to lay down our lives, and then he says what this means is it simply means helping each other when someone else has a need, right? I'm not talking about something dramatic where you have to be a martyr. He says what this means in day-to-day activity is being tenderhearted, compassionate, and helpful towards others. Now, sometimes when we get into verses like this, someone will immediately start talking about someone panhandling and should they roll down the window and hand them $1 and and it kind of takes the conversation in the wrong direction, right? And we end up discussing, what would a person do with it, and we get into all of those discussions, and that's not what we need to think about and distract ourselves from what is being said here. Because what John is clearly saying is that we need to be open-hearted, not to close our heart. I like his use of that metaphor, closing one's heart, right? Don't close your heart against someone else's need. He almost suggests that more naturally our heart is open and it's a deliberate action on my part to close it. And maybe that's actually true, isn't it? I mean, I think there's something about the way God has made us that we have, I would call it a created and natural affinity to feel what others are going through. And it takes a kind of action on our part to close that down, to ignore, to perhaps rationalize, and to stop feeling compassion for a fellow human being who's struggling. He's not saying we have to open our hearts. He says we just have to not close them. And I think there's a point there. I think the way God has made us, yes, we naturally feel compassion for others. But John says, in these kinds of simple acts, we will in fact be demonstrating how we are laying down our lives. All right? It's not dramatic. It's not something grandiose. It's something as simple as helping someone in need. Even though John talks about a kind of help where it involves, he says, if you have this world's goods, if he's talking about material things, maybe that's kind of a beginning place. But often the kind of help that others need is help that has to do with our presence, offering them dignity, seeing them as worthwhile human beings, paying attention, listening, right? I mean, I think sometimes those are actually the more important gifts than helping someone with something physical. I mean, that's not that the other is to be ignored, but maybe what he's starting with is the most basic kind of help. Someone's in need and you help them with something you have that you can give to them, and that helps them out. That's a starting place. But I think beyond that is extending a kind of friendship, a kind of willingness to listen. A lot of people need the help of patience. Love is patient. Love is kind. A lot of people need the help of someone being simply patient with them as they struggle, perhaps, as they annoy. The biggest challenge is not loving my enemies, it's loving the people who annoy me, right? My enemies are usually at a far distant, it's theoretical about my enemies. They're over far away somewhere. But who's up close are the people who just annoy me on a day-to-day basis, their mannerisms, whatever, their habits. And I think John would say, yes, lay down your life. Be patient with them. Be kind. Be forgiving. So that's what John's talking about here. He's talking about this kind of laying down your life, and it starts with simple things. Verse 18, little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. So it's kind of an obvious statement. Actions count a lot more than simply words. Perhaps John knew that a lot of people professed love for God. He knew that the church he was writing to, the Christians he was writing to, they sometimes talked about it really well. But John's urging them, actually put it into practice. Make sure that it's not just talk, that you actually show kindness and love. Now, the heart of what I want to get to is the latter part of this reading, starting in verse 19. We will know by this. And I think he means by what he's already talked about previously. Someone could argue by this is what he's going to say, but I think it's about what he already has said. In other words, we will know by this. By what, John? By the things I'm talking about, the simple ways you keep your heart open towards others. You don't close it off when they're in need. And instead, you respond and help them. We will know by this that we are of the truth. How do you know that you're really living out truly what it is that God has revealed to us in Christ? It comes down to simple things like, do you help those around you? When you do that, I think John is saying, you know you're of the truth. You know you're grounded in the true way here. You're doing what it is that God desires, that he has revealed to us in Christ, that God himself has done for us. And then he goes on, he says, we know that we are of the truth and will assure our heart before him in whatever our heart condemns us. I think if we have any degree of moral intelligence, any degree of self-awareness, we all know we mess up a lot. And we think of times where we weren't loving, and when we closed our heart, and when we found an excuse as to why we didn't need to help. Why helping is not the right thing to do, and I found a good reason to rationalize why I didn't help. And so if we have this kind of self-awareness, if we have some real understanding of the uneven nature of our own actions and attitudes, then our hearts do condemn us. Our conscience pokes at us. Maybe even while I'm talking about this today, you have a memory of something jumps into your mind where you didn't help someone, or you passed an opportunity to help someone. And you're already feeling a little bit of guilt about that, right? It's like, That's exactly what John's talking about. I mean, the person who does not have a heart that condemns us in these matters, I think is a person who is very much unaware of the call and nature of God's love and what it means for us to lay down our lives as Christ laid down his life. And of course, we're doing it in these very small and ordinary daily ways. But if we understand that, then we have a conscience, we have a heart, kind of an inner critic that's telling us we didn't do a good job. Some of us have more severe inner critics than others. I don't have a severe inner critic. I know some of you do. And that voice is always talking to you, and you never feel good enough. I am cursed or blessed, whatever it is, to sometimes feel like I am doing good enough, right? But then I'll suddenly realize I'm not after a little period of thinking I am, right? But we have, all of us, that voice inside that reminds us that we have failed. And notice what John is saying about this. He says, we know by this, by our actions of love, that we are of the truth, and will assure our heart before him, before God, in whatever our heart condemns us. For God is greater than our heart and knows all things. What John understands about God, and I'm afraid far too many people don't, is that our God, who is loving, merciful, kind, and yes, he disciplines us and trains us, but it's always out of love. It's always to bring us to what is better for us and for others. That this God overrules our heart. He overrules that inner critic. When your inner self is saying you didn't do well, you messed up there, you did wrong, God overrules that voice. He's greater than that voice. His affirmation of you is greater than your own heart condemnation of yourself. That's what John's saying. And he's grounding it in this. If you are making not perfect, flawless efforts, but he's saying if you know that you are trying to keep your heart open and trying to love people, even though you don't do that perfectly and you often mess up and your heart condemns you for your failures, he said, God, you can assure yourself you are in the truth, and God is greater than the condemnation that is being leveled by your own heart, because he knows everything. And part of what it means for God to know everything is he knows that you're not capable of everything. Sometimes that inner critic holds us to a standard of perfection. And it criticizes us every single time we don't do anything absolutely perfectly. But God, greater than our heart, knows that we're incapable of that and does not expect that of us, right? Amen. So he overrules that. He says the heart doesn't have the last say. I have the last say. Now notice what goes on in verse 21. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us. See, I don't think he's talking about two situations. Some people who have a heart that condemns them and some people who don't. No, I think he's saying we have a heart that condemns us and God overrules that. So now, once you know that God has overruled your inner critic, now you're in a position where your heart no longer condemns you. I mean, you still hear that voice, right? Your conscience still pricks you, but you are assured in his presence because you are abiding in the truth of his love and because you know he overruled the condemnation of your conscience. Here's our situation. And when our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence before God. And I think that's where John would have all of us to be. Even though we know we have imperfectly practiced the love of God this week, the further we look back, I think often the more we see in the far, perhaps long ago past, how we were just not very loving or accepting or welcoming. And hopefully we've grown and we've made progress, but sometimes we can look back years. I have the ability, one thing I did to someone as, I was like 12 years old and I'm passing communion in church and I passed it by the mother of my friend who had come that Sunday because I knew she was not a Christian. Of course, I passed her the collection plate, right? Of course. I live in horror. I have asked God, please may that woman not be as offended by my actions. And of course, I'm like 12 years old, but I'm doing what I was taught. And I'm thinking, how could I have been that unloving? I've been taught to be that way, to judge people, to not serve them communion if they were not Christians by our standards, but to take their money because they could contribute to our church. Well, I look back at things like that and I have to read a verse like this. God overrules that. I still feel awful about that event. God says, I'm greater than your heart. Stop beating yourself up about it. I've forgiven that, and I know what you were capable and weren't capable of. And I know that you've tried to live in love always, but always also imperfectly. So what John says, so now if I can let go of the condemnation of my heart, then I can have confidence before God. And each one of us can. We can be in that place of knowing I have no shame or guilt or embarrassment before God. Not because I deny my imperfections, but fully knowing my imperfections, I know that I have come into the presence of a God who loves me utterly, without reserve. The love of God is as infinite as God is God's self. There is no end to it. There can be no end to that love. And so there's no way that I can outrun it, outlast it, wear it out, lose it. But instead, God is greater. Yeah. Yep. That's where John would bring us. Now, what does that have to do with a good shepherd? Well, the one who is holding our hand, I thought that might be a good picture for good shepherd. I'm the child. Someone else, the shepherd, is holding my hand. He's the adult, and he's leading me to that place of knowing I can be confident with him. We can have confidence in the presence of our good shepherd, and that is our prayer always. Amen.